Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Tolman, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's presentation. We have a wonderful turnout today, and for those of you who are not familiar with JASA, we were founded as the Ukiyo-e Society of America in 1973, and over the years, our scope has broadened and our mission has diversified to include the study of all areas of Japanese arts and culture. We're also especially excited because next year we celebrate our 50th anniversary, which is a milestone for any small not-for-profit organization, and I'm sure you're all going to be hearing a lot about it in the months to come. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Natsu Oyobe, curator of Asian art at the University of Michigan. She also received her master's and Ph.D. degrees from the University of Michigan. In addition to being the museum's curator, Natsu also serves as consulting curator for the Detroit Institute of Arts, and just recently co-edited and also contributed an essay to Great Waves and Mountains, Perspectives and Discoveries in the Collecting of Japanese Art. I have finished reading many of the essays and I heartily recommend it. But today we are here to hear Natsu Oyobe speak about clay as soft power, the rise of Shigaraki Ware in the United States. Natsu, thank you.
Thank you, Alison, so much. And I also like to express my gratitude to Amy Poster and for giving me this opportunity, and to Helen Goldenberg for the technical support. I also want to thank MacTrap, who recommended to JASA to host my talk. The exhibition Clay as Soft Power, Shigaraki Ware in Postwar America and Japan opened last month at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, or UMA. It is an exhibition highlighting a significant role Japanese ceramics, more specifically Shigaraki Ware, played as a so-called soft power when the US and Japan aimed to rebuild their relationship during the Cold War era. In the later section, we focus on more recent developments of collecting Shigaraki Ware by private collectors. Since I heard that this is the first time a curator from a museum is speaking at JASA, I'd like to briefly talk about our museum. The University of Michigan's art collection is one of the oldest in the nation's universities. In 1856, years before the great civic art museums in Detroit, Toledo, or Chicago were founded, the university students and the general public had free access to an art gallery on campus. And that remains so today. Today, the museum's collections include more than 20,000 objects from Western, Asian, and African traditions, as well as modern and contemporary art. Along with Detroit Institute of Arts, we are a premier art museum for Japanese and Asian art collection in Michigan. Special exhibition space in the Alumni Memorial Hall, where the Clay as Soft Power exhibition is currently held. This was opened in 1910. The inaugural exhibition showed the private collection of Charles Lang Freer before it went to Washington, D.C. So Japanese and Asian art have been regularly exhibited at our museum, including this most recent exhibition. The exhibition consists of more than 50 works from UMA's collection, as well as loans from public and private collections in the US and Japan. This is the first US exhibition focusing on Shigaraki Ware, one of the 6 ancient kilns of Rokkoyo of Japan, along with Bizen, Tamba, Echizen, Seto, and Tokoname. So what is really Shigaraki Ware? Definition of Shigaraki Ware is very complex, as the pottery industry in Shigaraki has developed from producing storage and cooking vessels for the nearby farming community in the 13th century to becoming a large production site for any kind of ceramic styles and functions, for more mass consumption during the Edo period. It became more complex in the modern times as pottery studios and studio artists in other regions can purchase clay from Shigaraki and make Shigaraki-style ware. In this exhibition, we focus on yakishime or unglazed wood-fired wares, most commonly associated with the name Shigaraki ware. After all, the yakishime or unglazed wood-fired wares, so yakishime is the style that became mostly known in America associated with Shigaraki, the name Shigaraki, and most studio artists in Shigaraki are focusing on. Shigaraki ware's rustic appearance was first celebrated by tea practitioners of Chanoyu, or Japanese tea ceremony, in the 16th century. Many names were coined to describe Shigaraki ware's distinctive features, such as hai kaburi, or ash-covered blackened section, kani no me, or crab eyes, to refer to white spots, and ishihaze, or stone burst, where a small feldspar stone, choseki, breaks the clay. The translucent glaze of different shades of greens is the result of floating ash fusing on the surface of the clay during the firing. They are called shizenyu, translated as natural ash glaze, meaning that it is not applied before firing. So why did I conceive the idea of having an exhibition of Shigaraki ware? First, state of Michigan and Shiga Prefecture, where Shigaraki is located, are sister states for more than 50 years. I wanted to celebrate this long relationship. Also in 2016, I participated in the workshop for international curators and museum shop managers organized by the Overseas Human Resources and Industry Development Association, a very long name, an organization affiliated with Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. I had a chance to learn history and contemporary practice of Shigaraki ware in depth. However, I do not want to present a survey history of Shigaraki ware and more interested in showing it from a perspective that is relevant for American audience. Through research, I found that many historic Shigaraki ware, especially those large-size storage jars, entered American museums and private collections in the post-war period, especially between 1960s and 80s, and wondered why. That started me looking at the collecting history of Shigaraki ware, backed by the intersections of US-Japan relationship from the immediate post-war period through the present. I divided the story of collecting Shigaraki ware into 3 sections, but the chronologies and themes are often overlapped and intertwined. First, the exhibition and collecting history of Shigaraki and Japanese unglazed wares by US museums in the post-war until 1980s. The second is the cultural exchanges between American and Japanese ceramic artists in the 1960s when artists based in Michigan went to Shigaraki, and after the 1990s, when Ceramic Art Museum, Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park started the international residency program for ceramic artists. Third, contribution of American private collectors after the 2000s. So in the following presentation, I will walk you through these 3 sections. The first section, representing Japan, Shigaraki ware in post-war collecting and exhibitions, looks at the introduction of Shigaraki ware in America during the 4 decades after World War II. Like Zen spiritualism and the avant-garde calligraphy, Shigaraki ware was promoted by the United States as a means of fostering public support for US-Japan coalition against communism. Shigaraki ware's simple, rustic aesthetic was considered an ideal vehicle for rebranding Japan as a peaceful, democratic ally. Until the 1940s, the contemporary Japanese ceramics known to most Americans were delicate, elegantly decorated porcelain and stoneware made for export. After World War II, the American public was introduced to Mingei, or folk art ceramics, and contemporary revivals of historic rustic wares produced in the Momoyama period, including the naturally glazed wares of Shigaraki, Bizen, and Tamba. One of the people behind the introduction was James Marshall Plummer, specialist of East Asian ceramic art and professor of art history at the University of Michigan. He stayed in Japan from 1948 to 49 as a fine arts advisor under the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers. He conducted research on cultural properties all over Japan. And this is a photo of a faculty member at the Center for Japanese Studies, the University of Michigan. And I will not go into details of each of them, but many of them really played important roles in the academic and also cultural exchanges between two countries in the post-war period. In 1950, Plummer curated the first exhibition of Japanese art in the post-war US, titled Japanese Pottery, Old and New at Detroit Institute of Arts, and introduced folk type and rustic wares from historic and contemporary, selected from all over Japan. And I have to be reminded that this is still under occupation in Japan. So any international loans have to be arranged through the special, made special arrangements. So SCAP's help was very necessary. It is telling that the first post-war show of Japanese art was ceramics, which included contemporary pieces. In this exhibition, Japanese ceramics were introduced as art form born out of simple farming life of Japanese people. It was a stark contrast from highly polished ornamental porcelain wares many Americans were familiar with. In the DIA exhibition catalog essay, Plummer accused potters of these types of wares as having, quote, labored tiresomely on individual pieces made only for exhibition and won academic prizes for work poorly done, end quote. Another person who played an important role in the introduction of Minge and Yakishime, one glazed ware, was John D. Rockefeller III. In 1954, Museum of Modern Art in New York organized 3 Japanese art exhibitions, to which Rockefeller financially supported. The first one was a solo exhibition of Kitaoji Rosanjin, which included his Shigaraki and Bizen ware works, among other ceramic styles inspired by Momoyama period wares. Another Japanese art exhibition at MoMA was Japanese Exhibition House, a life-size reconstruction modeled after Shoin-zukuri, pictured here. In the house's main hall, you see on the right, there was a large unglazed jar that stood out strikingly against the pale natural wood and tatami mats. James Marshall Plummer and John D. Rockefeller worked closely with the US government in post-war Japan, where they befriended scholars, museum professionals, private collectors, government officials, and business leaders. In this period, the US government encouraged individuals and private foundations to provide financial and human resources for promoting cultural exchange with Japan. Plummer and Rockefeller, whose professional interests and personal feelings aligned the government's desire to shift public opinion about Japan and its people, rose to this challenge. The most enduring mode of displaying the large unglazed jars in American museums, however, was to pair them with highly decorative Japanese folded screen paintings, or byobue, which were also popular as an art form representative of post-war Japan. The 1953 exhibition, Japanese paintings and sculptures from the 6th century AD to the 19th century, organized jointly by the Japanese and US governments, toured 6 major cities in the US. It included many large, impressive screen paintings, which soon began to be found in other Japanese art exhibitions and permanent galleries in American museums. In 1967, for example, the Cleveland Museum of Art held an exhibition featuring its rich collection of screen paintings paired with large-scale vessels. In Cleveland, the pairing display continued when they opened its new Oriental Art Gallery in 1970. And in 1973, they purchased an important Shigaraki Ware jar from the Muromachi period for its permanent collection and displayed it in the new gallery. The jar, which was purchased from a dealer in Kyoto, was once in the collection of Shirasu Masako, author, collector, and one of the cultural icons of 20th century Japan. The elegant but solid round shape, warm and varied fire marks, and quickly added thatch patterns make this jar one of the most beloved Shigaraki Ware storage jars. Throughout the 1980s, many Yakishime ware jars were acquired by American museums and private collectors, sometimes in combination with screen paintings. At UMA, we purchased our Shigaraki Ware jar, that's in the middle, in 1986 from the same dealer who sold UMA 2 pairs of screens in 1987 and 1988. And one on the left is the Met jar, also from the in the exhibition. It was probably collected in early 1970s. In the Louise Court's book, I'll talk a little bit about that later. This jar was published as part of the Burke collection. In the exhibition, we are displaying a pair of screens by Matsumura Goshun, which entered the collection in 1974, and the Shigaraki Ware jar purchased in 1986 to make the point. So many jars from not only Shigaraki, but also Bizen, Ichizen, Tamba, and Tokoname made between the 14th and the early 17th centuries came to the United States. Shigaraki Ware was the most popular among those Yakishime wares, possibly because of the town's proximity to Kyoto, where most important dealers were based. And also in the 60s, there were more cases of existing jars in farming houses in Shiga and Mie prefectures. Domon Ken, a very famous Japanese photographer, noted that sort of a conversation with the dealer, Mr. Kondo Kingo, that Mr. Kondo saw about 700 to 800 jars in Shiga and another 300 in Mie. But he also noted that it's good ones are rare. So speaking of Domon Ken and his conversation with Mr. Kondo, so Mr. Kondo noted that, quote, Shigaraki, Kondo says, he was skeptical when he first saw one American collector was desperately and eagerly looking for Shigaraki Ware jars. So that was like early 1960s. But soon he had a moment of revelation and became obsessed with collecting them. So in other words, the American collector opened Mr. Kondo's eyes. So you can see from this conversation how important American eyes and how changed that sort of game of collecting. So the second section, now we are moving on to the second section, focuses on another component of soft power diplomacy between the US and Japan in the post-war era, the exchange of artists, which led to the incorporation of Shigaraki forms and techniques into the work of prominent American ceramic artists. In the 1950s, with public and private supports, major contemporary ceramic artists such as Hamada Shoji, Kitaoji Rosanjin, and Kaneshige Toyo came to the US. And I should note that the introduction of these artists from different groups, such as Mingei, like Hamada, or Momoyan period revivalists like Rosanjin and Kaneshige, so they happen under the same kind of discourse, the same interest toward the folk and rustic type of ceramics ware in post-war America. So the understanding of these, wares is quite different from what was going on in Japan. So these artists visited various ceramic centers and art schools around the United States to give lectures and demonstrations. There, US-based ceramic artists experienced firsthand the creation process, techniques, and philosophies behind making of rustic type wares. In 1957, Bizen artist Kaneshige Toyo visited the University of Michigan after Honolulu and Los Angeles and showcased the technique of wheel throwing. One of the attendees was John Stevenson, then a graduate student at nearby Cranbrook Academy of Art. In 1962, Stevenson, now teaching at the University of Michigan, and his wife and ceramic artist Suzanne traveled to Japan with the purpose of researching and learning about wood-fired kilns producing unglazed ware. After a short time in Kyoto, they were introduced to Takahashi Rakusai III in Shigaraki and started working in the Rakusai studio. And on the right, you see notebooks that Stevenson's recorded. This is a plate made by Stevenson at Rakusai Studio. Works made by the Stevensons in Shigaraki reveal their efforts to learn the techniques, while trying to be expressive in non-glazed ware on their own terms. Soon after returning to Michigan, John Stevenson abandoned functional forms and began to create ceramic sculptures, and the lessons from Shigaraki were visible in undulating forms and the rough surface treatments produced by scraping the clay and leaving fire marks. His wife, Suzanne Stevenson, created this jar on the left in reference to a traditional Shigaraki shape. After her return, she continued to create functional wares, such as large plates and vases using colorful glazes, and the flowing formation of clay and glaze of her vessels is reminiscent of the expressionistic surface of Shigaraki ware. Another Michigan-based ceramic artist, Joseph Zerbs, received the Fulbright Fellowship to study the 6 ancient kilns of Japan. First settled in Kyoto, Zerbs was introduced to Takahashi Rakusai III by Kondo Yuzo, then professor of ceramic art at the Kyoto City University of Arts. Some of you know he was a grandfather of Kondo Takahiro. Later, Zerbs found a studio and house in the village of Domura near Shigaraki and lived there until 1967. Using highly malleable Shigaraki clay, Zerbs created vessel forms without conventional functions. After her return from Shigaraki, she continued to experiment with surface treatments. These artists did not try to recreate wood-fired unglazed wares in the US or seek to reproduce Shigaraki ware's common characteristics, which are the product of unique combination of materials, training, and technique. They were rather inspired to experiment by its asymmetrical forms and expressive surfaces. In the 1970s, more American artists traveled to Japan to study, funded by Fulbright and other fellowship and funds, including Rob Barnard. He studied at the Kyoto City University of Arts and then moved to Domura using the same studio that Zerbs stayed at. Then in 1979, ceramic historian and curator Louis Addison Court published a seminal book, Shigaraki, Potter's Valley. It was a culmination of more than 10 years of study and remained as the only scholarly monograph of Shigaraki Ware in English or in Japanese. And until Court published Seto and Mino ceramics in the 80s, only one of the 6 ancient kilns of Rokkoyo. The impact of the book was tremendous, especially among American ceramic artists interested in wood-fired unglazed wares. So now the visits of these American artists, especially in the 1960s, profoundly impacted the course of one Shigaraki women artist's career. Koyama Kyoko remembers her sense of revelation when she saw Suzanne Stevenson and Georgette Zerbs working side by side with male potters at the Rakusai studio and taking part in firing, a task that was generally not allowed for women. As ceramic historian Kazuko Todate tells in her essay in the exhibition catalog, it was believed that success with wood-fired kilns required so-called divine power, divine favor, and superstitions held that women were impure and therefore displeased the fire deity. While men were forming clay, their wives, daughters, and sisters helped turn the potter's wheels, as seen in this image on the left. Or women made smaller wares and painted decorations, as Koyama Kyoko originally did. Koyama soon began creating her own works and submitting them to juried exhibitions. By 1970, she had built her own kiln so that she could experiment with natural ash glaze without needing to borrow space in other potters' kilns. The rise of women artists like Koyama also paved the way for younger generations of Shigaraki women artists. Takahashi Yoshiko, who creates classic foliating vessels, is the great-granddaughter of Rakusai III. When she becomes the head of the family studio in the future, Yoshiko will be the first woman to succeed to the Rakusai name. This foliated jar on the right was commissioned for the exhibition. It is a touchable jar for visitors to feel the distinctive surface of Shigaraki ware. Now I'd like to go back to the history of cultural exchanges. In the 1980s, the driving force behind US-Japan cultural diplomacy began to shift. As Japan's vast profit in trade and real estate boom caused anti-Japanese sentiment, US government and private support began to diminish. And the Japanese government and its affiliated organization, Japan Foundation, established in 1972, stepped into the gap, supporting art exhibitions and artist exchanges between the two countries. Between 1980 and 81, Shigaraki artist Otani Shiro spent 1 year at the University of Tennessee with funding from the Cultural Agency of Japan. He built a wood-fired anagama, or tunnel kiln, at the Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts, and fired unglazed wares made by him and other artists. Since then, Otani has conducted many workshops all over the United States. Willie Singleton, who trained in Tamba and spent time in Shigaraki, worked as Otani's assistant in many of these workshops. Singleton, living in Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania, sources clay and ash glaze locally and creates stunning glaze wares in wood-fired kilns. The connection to the land in ceramic making is something he learned from his training in Japan and experience with Japanese artists like Otani. On the left is a magnificent vase with dynamic slashing lines and beautiful natural ash glaze by Otani. This was in the collection of John Mervis and recently purchased by UMA with support of Joe and Nancy Keithley. Another Shigaraki artist, Koyama Yasuhisa, has conducted several workshops in Cleveland Institute of Art and Kent State University in Ohio since the 1990s. In the 90s, the opening of the Shigaraki Ceramic Cultural Park, or Toge no Mori in Japanese, established a formal venue for international exchange. In addition to a gallery space, it has an international residency program with a wide studio space, different types of kilns, and support staff members. In 30 years since, more than 700 artists participated in the program, and American artists are the largest contingent. Compared to the artists who spent time in Shigaraki in earlier times, many of the resident artists are more established. Peter Bokos, probably the most influential ceramic artist of the 20th century, conducted workshops there in 1995 and 96. In the 1950s, Bokos was drawn to the element of chance, the rough surfaces and cracks and tears in Shigaraki and Bizen wares he saw in books. Now he was at last able to work with the material and the kilns used to make these wares in Japan. This work on the right, made during the workshop entitled Ice Bucket, was his interpretation of a historic mizusashi or water jar used for Japanese tea ceremony. Bokos and his collaborator Peter Callas brought a crate of Shigaraki clay back to the United States, and Bokos made his signature stacks with the clay at Callas' wood-fired Anagama kiln in New Jersey. Dirk Larsen and Ashwini Bhatt are more recent resident artists at the Ceramic Park. Larsen, who's married to porcelain-ware artist Ueda Kasumi, now lives in Kyoto and creates Shigaraki wares. Now, since the 2000s, there has been a resurgence of interest in contemporary Shigaraki ware in the United States, spurred by private collectors of Japanese ceramics, who came to know Shigaraki ware through dealers and private trips to Japan. Many of the private collections with strong presence of contemporary Shigaraki ware feature works by those active in the Shigaraki area, but also artists from outside of Shigaraki who use Shigaraki clay and wood-fired kilns for producing unglazed wares, such as Tsujimura Shiro, shown here. To find them, many collectors relied on dealers specializing in contemporary Japanese ceramics who have contacts within networks of Japanese artists. Dealer Joan Mervis has been building relationships with artists since the 1980s. She has been instrumental in bringing to the US major works in a Shigaraki ware style by Tsuji Seimei, Wada Morihiro, and Tsujimura Shiro. Like Mervis, Beatrice Chan shows works by contemporary Shigaraki ware artists, including Kohara Yasuhiro and Sasayama Tadayasu in her gallery, Daiichi Arts in New York City. Another major American dealer is Robert Yelling, based in Kyoto. After starting out as a collector and ceramic art critic in the 1990s, Yelling developed extensive relationships with Japanese artists and helped to introduce many American collectors to artists throughout Japan. Yelling has a personal preference for unglazed wares and promotes them through his business and social media. And this is one of the most recent posts that I saw on Instagram, his Instagram account. Collectors Robert and Lisa Kessler, based in Colorado, have an extensive collection of Shigaraki ware by established artists such as Tsuji and Koyama Yasuhisa, and younger artists such as Ishiyama Tetsuya and Takahashi Yoshiko. The work on the left here is by Koyama, which reminds us of the rocky terrains of the American Southwest, where the Kesslers live. The Kesslers were introduced to Shigaraki artists by Yelling, and now regularly visit their studios on their own. Their Shigaraki ware collection includes works by several artists who are not often represented in other American collectors, such as Kobayashi Yucho. In the mid-2010s, the Kesslers purchased an enormous-sized jar with intricate wave design from Kobayashi, which now sits at the entrance of their private gallery space. So you can see part of the jar on the right corner, bottom corner here. Like this case, the preference for larger, more experimental works among American collectors, which departs from Japan's traditional market of chanoyu and ikebana vessels, has begun to affect the practice of ceramics in Shigaraki. Collectors Carol and Jeffrey Horvitz have worked closely with Mervis and other dealers to acquire major pieces of contemporary Japanese ceramics, aiming to create an encyclopedic collection. The magnificent jar by Tsujimura I showed earlier is one of their collection highlights. This work was shown in an exhibition at the Ham Museum of Art at the University of Florida, as well as other museums. Here's another masterpiece from the Horvitz collection, a vase by Wada Morihiro. The Kesslers, the Horvitz, and many other collectors have been willing to lend and gift works to museums and support acquisitions of new works in collaboration with museum curators, making contemporary Shigaraki ware more accessible to the public. These collectors recognize Shigaraki ware as one of the significant currents of Japanese ceramic art. And through these public forms, Shigaraki ware has had more exposures. So as shown, collecting Shigaraki ware in the US has been intertwined with the bilateral relationship between US and Japan in the post-war period. Even in the contemporary time, the private collectors play more important roles. The Japanese government continues to promote Shigaraki and other traditional wares, organizing and supporting exhibitions and programs, hoping to increase international tourism. Although this exhibition focused on Shigaraki ware, other yakishime wares like bizen and tamba, or folk pottery such as onda wares, their interactions with the American museum professionals, scholars, and collectors are something to note. I hope that this exhibition will further encourage the interest in research of these stories. The exhibition is on view until May 7, 2023, next year. In April, we will invite 2 women artists from Shigaraki and Michigan, Yoshiko Takahashi and Georgia Zerbs, to have a dialogue on their career paths and experiences in Shigaraki. For more precise dates and updates, please check our Museum UMA's website early next year. Thank you so much for your listening, and now I'm happy to take your questions. Oh, Alison, you are muted.
I will unmute myself. How's that? Thank you so much. We do have a number of questions from the beginning. One of the first questions was, how were the first potters from Japan, because this would have been during the occupation, who funded their travel? Was it the Cultural Ministry? I mean, this would have been a government initiative, right? For the
so Hamada Shoji came with Yanagi Soetsu and Bernard Leach. That was funded by Mainichi newspapers. It's a newspaper company, but still very close to, as many of you know, probably that newspaper companies, broadcasting casting company, they work quite close with culture exchange. So and Kaneshige's case, that was supported by Asia Foundation, the foundation to promote academic and culture exchange. They are not so active these days, but back then it was quite active supporting this kind of exchange. And Rosanjin is an interesting case. He refused to receive any outside funding. But his exhibition at MoMA was supported by the Rockefellers.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Another question is, what do you think was the chief appeal of Shigaraki Ware? I mean, you mentioned in your presentation that it was not ornate.
Not ornate, yeah. Well, if I speak about recent, private collectors, they are drawn to Shigaraki Ware. As I mentioned in the talk, that it's a very distinctive, unique tradition of Japan, Japanese ceramics. That's one reason. And also, many of them are drawn to sort of abstract nature of Shigaraki ware or bizen, other big yakishime type of ware that you can sort of make of like landscape. I mean, think about like landscape or even like universe. When for example, looking at the work by Furutani Michio from the Hobbes collection, I mean, you see that these white dots, rosebud spots, they look like stars. So you can kind of make sort of imagine these kind of different things just looking at the surface of Shigaraki ware.
One of the questioners says, "Thank you for this fascinating presentation," and she's looking forward to visiting the exhibit. She wonders about how American collectors in the post-war period thought about the rustic look of Shigaraki ware. At that moment, occupied Japan was often imagined as a developing nation. Was such an expectation that Japan was, in quotation marks, behind, shaping Americans' interest in that kind of ceramics rather than more polished or fancy work, would you think?
Yeah, that's really the point that I wanted to try to make. I mean, it's not necessary. Maybe the American public was really saw the beauty in Shigaraki. I think it's kind of challenging for many audience. Yeah, I mean, this is that kind of ware that people like Plummer and Rockefeller tried to bring from Japan, but it doesn't really necessarily mean that if general public get that. I kind of doubt that. And yeah, so for it's different for artists. So ceramic artists, they're really was knowing that Shigaraki ware, this kind of ware, was really big revelation for them. This kind of tradition is very different, and they wanted to try that. They want to know more about these type of wares. So I mean, so maybe a combination, like a plumber trying to bring this type of work to this country, and someone like John Stevenson's who brought the technique. I mean, that probably what was going on in Michigan is quite, let's say, unique in a way. Yeah.
Maybe before we because we have other questions about Shigaraki ware, but that brings me to a question from Amy, who says, "Thank you so much for a fabulous presentation, first of all, but how would you distinguish the ceramics in the University of Michigan collection? Do you think that the artists and potters had an effect on the collection, or was this a curatorial initiative of the museum?"
Yeah, I think the artists and the teachers like Stevenson really made made our collection quite different, unique. So Stevenson actually purchased 17 works of contemporary Japanese ceramics for Uma's collection in 1963. So And he was trying to be, let's say, he wanted to create like sort of balanced collection. However, it represents works from by Takashi Rakusai and Kaneshige Toyo. And also some works not by Hamada but other Mingei artists. So and it was quite unique back then that have these Yakishime type wares in the museum collection. So and mainly, I mean, he purchased those for teaching purpose, for teaching next generation of ceramic artists in this country. So yeah, in that way, I mean, it's quite unique.
Another question is from Diana Yang, who asks, for contemporary clay artists from outside Japan, what are the key factors that help define their works as Shigaraki ware? Would it be technique, style, materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I asked several people, artists, curators in Japan, what really defines contemporary Shigaraki ware. And some people, especially people from Shigaraki, insisted that you have to work in Shigaraki to be Shigaraki ware artist. But like Bokos, he brought Shigaraki clay into America and created works. And in this exhibition, at least, I try to say that these are also considered Shigaraki ware.
How do you see the relationship between Shigaraki and Iga ceramics?
Yeah. So as some of you know, that the Shigaraki is located adjacent to Iga. So the clay available to both areas in both areas are quite similar. However, I mean, Iga, there's a slight difference in terms of color. So you see more like the clay color is a little bit more whitish, pale, and also I think it's all magic of what's happening inside the kiln. So the natural glaze that happen in kiln becomes more sort of greenish, and that becomes sort of characteristic of Iga. And also historically, that Iga ware is more, was part of the daimyo, that warlord in the area supported and the production of Iga ware. So you see lots of Iga ware in probably more than Shigaraki ware in tea culture, so in tea ceremony setting. So the history is a little different.
We have a loaded question here. The part one is, do Shigaraki kilns still have access to good sources of traditional quality Shigaraki clay? And the part two is, and can American potters still have access to this good quality Shigaraki clay?
Yeah, that's a loaded questions. Yeah, getting good clay. Yeah, but I mean, the Shigaraki clay, maybe other people in the audience probably can answer better, but it seems that it's decreasing, the getting the quality clay is decreasing for sure, but if you have a good connection, I guess, I think you can still get them. Yeah, Americans. Well, I have to say that you can actually clay that's kind of similar in quality, in this country too. There are several clay, say the clay merchants, clay shops that you can get sort of a similar type of clay, like Shigaraki type in this country.
Hollis Goodall sends her regards and asks, she's curious, do you feel that the explosion of interest in Zen and Shibui design in the late 1940s and early 1950s opened the eyes of Americans to yakishime?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I agree with you. Yeah. There's a exhibition in at the Brooklyn Museum, I think probably also around late 1950s, of showing like a dinnerware, dinnerware setting. And you see in a photo that behind there's a hanging scroll and like Shigaraki-like pot. So these are, shown at the museum as a kind of a cool kind of interior design or interior setting for all public. So yes, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit more about James Marshall Plummer and how he promoted yakishime?
Yeah, so James Marshall Plummer, unfortunately, he died very young in 1960. So if he, have lived longer, probably he was more active promoting this yakishime ware. But he, one of the students he had was Shaman Lee. And Shaman Lee, of course, purchased the magnificent Shigaraki jar that we are so fortunate to borrow from Cleveland. And also, Shaman Lee was very interested in promoting folk art. So he organized exhibition around folk art. So yeah, I mean, I have to mention that Plummer also was instrumental to bring Kaneshige Toyo. So yeah, I think he tried many ways, but yeah, I think his student like Sherman Lee also sort of continue Plummer's legacy.
Did any of the Japanese potters end up staying in Michigan and influencing their own students in America, or did they mostly return to Japan?
They mostly returned to Japan. I think they all, he's not, of course, yakishime artist, but Hamada Shoji came back to Michigan in 1967 and received the honorary Ph.D. degree. So and he there's a film that he did a public demonstration on the occasion, and I think he had lots of interactions with the students.
Sinead is thanking you for your wonderful contextualization of the Cleveland Museum of Art's vessel as part of the exhibition, and she looks very much forward to visiting it. It's an honor to have your scholarship, she wanted you to know. And I wanted to sort of continue that and find out, what have you learned after putting this exhibition together? Did you have any questions that when you started contextualizing all the objects, you thought, oh, I'm going to think a different way about Shigaraki?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I really focus on what's going on in Michigan, and I just realized how deeply, Michigan was, contributed in this, the introduction of Shigaraki Ware. So, and through this project, I looked into our museum's collection, archival materials really in depth. And I hope that this really brings up, I mean, there's so much has written about Peter Volkos, his encounter with Japanese yakishime ware. But hopefully this, exhibition really, brought the sort of a different perspective in that kind of a singular history. And so that was, yeah, I mean, quite rewarding doing this project.
I hope that many people who are attending this webinar will have a chance to visit Natsu's exhibition, which, as you can see on the screen, it runs through May 7th 2023. Natsu-san, thank you very, very much. I learned a lot, and I think our audience did as well. And I invite you all to join us again for our next webinar, which will be January 18th of 2023, The 5 Directions Lacquer in East Asia by Dr. Einor Cervone of the Denver Art Museum. I'm actually speaking to you from Tokyo, so I'm going to wish everyone Yoi Otoshi-o, which means a good year ahead and a very healthy, happy, and peaceful holiday season. Thank you on behalf of the JASA Program Committee. Good evening.